Well, this has been a passion project of his. And on the subject of the other versions of Nosferatu, in preparation for this, I decided to watch the two most famous ones, which is the original 1922 film and then Werner Herzog's 1979 adaptation, which is a strange hybrid because it's telling the story of Nosferatu, the 1922 film, but changes everybody's names so that they're back to the original Bram Stoker name. So it's not Nosferatu, it's Count Dracula. You're not following Thomas Hutter, you're following Jonathan Harker. So it's a strange mix of the two, but overall follows the same beats with a few additions that Herzog put in himself. And it was the first Herzog film that I've ever watched. I really enjoyed it. I've got to admit, I much preferred it to the original one, because the original one, I understand, is a German expressionist classic. It set the stage for a lot of different film techniques, special effects. The use of shadow especially is wonderful. But perhaps I'm just spoiled by the delights of colour and sound that we get these days with films. The actual style of silent film does not work as well for me.
I was thinking about this in terms of aviation, because I agree that the 22 film is very important and it's very useful for film analysis, perhaps. However, as an actual thing to watch, I think more recent forays are better. And it's similar in my mind to, you know, an old biplane compared to, say, well, maybe not a Boeing 747. Those are a bit dodgy. Like, I don't know, a modern plane. You know, the old biplane has a certain charm to it. It's, you know, a bit fanciful and a little bit outdated, but also it's got a lot of character to it. However, if you were to actually use the product to sound sort of disgustingly consumerist, you would rather use the modern one because the technology has moved so far.
Objectively, it's just better, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we do have to, you know, thank the original for being made in the first place, because otherwise we wouldn't be getting wonderful adaptations of the story like Robert Eggers' version.
Yeah, and it also doesn't mean that we can't acknowledge the fact that it was very important at the time of its release and it was very influential. However, sometimes these things don't necessarily translate well, at least in my opinion.
I think it also didn't help that because it's public domain and there are so many different versions of the film, the version that I watched half of, that I watched first, was a public domain one on YouTube, which had remastered the picture so it was all nice crisp HD and changed a lot of the cards and also used very different music. And the picture as well was in black and white, where the original one is tinted depending on what time of the day it's supposed to be. So the nighttime scenes were all shot during the day, but on the original version, they're tinted blue so that you know that it's taking place at nighttime. This was all picture-perfect, crisp, black and white, so it just looks like Nosferatu himself is just roaming about in the middle of the day, which confused me somewhat. And then the worst part was the music that they chose. It's a horror film. It's a gothic horror film. Some might argue the original gothic horror film. It's supposed to have scary music with organ stings to let you know when you're supposed to jump. This had the most pleasant classical music playing in the background. Mm-hmm. It wasn't quite to the level of do 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 do, but it was close. And I almost fell asleep 10 times watching it. So I was like, what on earth is all the big fuss about with this? And
then Dracula film to fall asleep to.
I know. And then I found a better version of it, which was more along the lines of the original, with better title, with better cards used, the tinting kept there, lower picture quality, but that actually helped. And the entire thing was soundtracked by Spooky Organ.
So there's two things to say here. First of all, the director, Robert Eggers, actually told a story about how he saw a still from the original Nosferatu and he thought it was the coolest thing he'd ever seen. And he said to his mum, I want to watch this film. And so they ordered it in the video store and it took a month to arrive. And apparently, because it was quite old as well, it was quite grainy and worn out, and he said that actually added to the film because he had seen more modern recreations, I suppose, or remasters, whatever you want to call it, and the precision of the image didn't help it. Actually, the sort of fading and degradation of it helped sell the original films.
I think it becomes more immersive with something like that. It feels more like you're watching something that's real rather than a piece of fiction.
I'd like to think of it as sort of him almost thinking it's like found footage. As a young kid. But one important thing about that you're talking about the original is that they used sort of slides to colour the thing. That's exactly how Eggers gets the amazing nighttime scenes. Some of the best visuals of nighttime and darkness I think I've ever seen in a film, by the way, which is saying something because, of course, so many films do it. Normally, in a lot of modern cinema, when it's very dark, and there's a sort of love of the dark over the past 5 to 10 years in both TV and cinema. I'm thinking Game of Thrones was very guilty of it.
Oh, don't remind me of Game of Thrones.
I know, but you tend not to be able to make out anything. But what Eggers did was had it very bright, but then put they basically eliminated the reds at the camera level, and had a blue filter over it, so it's mostly blue and green light, but mostly blue. There would still be a little bit of green there, but that gives you an impression of things being illuminated by moonlight, and that
it
really works
very well. And
I was so surprised at how well done it was, and it really goes well to sell the film as a really polished piece of cinema, I suppose.
Oh yeah, I mean, this is one of the best looking films I've ever watched.
I agree.
Honestly, every frame is gorgeous in this film, and it's very, very impressive because Eggers is already a very technically accomplished filmmaker.
Well, let's talk about his previous films, actually, because that's important.
Just let me...
Okay.
This film was on what is today considered a mid-level budget, which was about $50 million. And I believe globally it's already taken in more than $100 million. So if you were to account for marketing as well, it's already broken even, which is really good to see, because I would like to see more directors take on passion projects like this and be rewarded for it, rather than somebody like Robert Eggers get sucked into the studio system where they would get him to churn out crap for a few years and then decide, because the crap that they've hired him as a director for, as gun for hire, didn't make them the money back, then all of a sudden his career is ruined. I'm glad he's not taking that road.
Yeah, because many talented directors have fallen prey to that, and also actors have gone into those films for the promise of a paycheck, and they've struggled to get away from it. I think a good example of someone who's lived in the shadow of just accepting bad films is Nicolas Cage, and people say he's a bad actor, but it's not his acting. He elevates the bad films he's in. It's not that he's dragging it down, quite to the contrary. It's just that I think he got into a lot of debt and had to just accept lots of films and churn them out.
I believe it was the IRS wanted a lot of... Because Nicolas Cage was not the most diligent in paying his government taxes.
Just another reason to like the guy.
And as a result, it ended up with him having to star in a lot of bad films so he could pay them back.
Well, now he lives in the UK, doesn't he? He's got a house in Bath.
Also, he just loves starring in films. I think he's just mental and loves starring in films, which, more respect to him. But on the subject of the budget, right, to show how overinflated the typical Hollywood budget...
well, he's like a litmus test for will I watch that film? There are lots of actors like that where if they're in the film, I won't watch it.
And it's
also,
shame.
Willem Dafoe is in this one. He's a much better actor than The Rock. It's not even...
Yeah.
It feels insulting comparing them. And I don't think he would... In fact, I think Willem Dafoe actually approached Eggers and said, I want to work with you, rather than the other way around.
Well, it's an excellent working relationship thus far, because the first collaboration they had was The Lighthouse, and since then he's been in The Northman and now Nosferatu. The only film he's not been in was The Witch. Let's
talk about these films then. So Eggers' sort of filmography is The Witch was released in 2015, The Lighthouse in 2019, and The Northman in 2022. And I think it's worth just talking briefly about those films because I think my favourite out of all of Eggers' films is The Lighthouse.
I'd have to agree with you there. The Lighthouse, for what it's aiming for, is perfect in every detail of that film. You can tell that it's the work of a genius artsy mind. It's not the sort of film that appeals to many people. I've shown it to friends. I got my family to watch it. They all came out of the other end of it disgusted and horrified that I got them to sit through it. But I think it's a masterpiece.
So do I, yeah. I think everything about it was done well. The fact that he used sort of film that was authentic to the time he was trying to set it in, the aspect ratio, he got the dialogue was actually taken from old lighthouse keepers' journals and things like that. And he'd read lots and lots of period appropriate things to make sure there were no anachronistic things that stuck out. He also got two good actors in Willem Dafoe and Robert Pattinson, of course, known for the Twilight films, but he's much more than that. He's actually a very solid actor.
He's an excellent actor when you get him with the right director in the right role, and The Lighthouse was a standout performance for him and for Willem Dafoe as well. And
both of them, yeah.
Yeah, and you can see why after you start in something like that with that director, you'd go, all right, this guy's got a visionary eye, and I want to work with him more. If it means I get to do more performances like this, more excellent character work like this, because outside of anything else you can say about The Lighthouse, which is... for how claustrophobic and small scale it is, it's also very expansive in the interpretations and themes that you can glean from it. I've even seen some interpretations, which I would quite agree with, is that it's a stealth retelling of the myth of Prometheus.
I've seen that one as well. Yeah.
Where Robert Pattinson is trying to steal fire, represented by the light at the top of the lighthouse, for the sake of expanding man's knowledge, and he's being guarded from it by Willem Dafoe, who's representing the rest of the pantheon, Poseidon in particular.
There are a few scenes that are explicit nods to Greek mythology as well.
And the last shot of the entire film where Pattinson's getting his guts eaten out by the crows.
Sorry if you wanted to watch the film.
Well, you know, I imagine there's still a lot more to the film.
That's true.
If you want to watch it.
Even if you know what happens, it's one of those films where if you watch it knowing what happens, you're still in for a wild ride and a good time.
Yeah. So, you know, I love The Lighthouse. After that, I'm trying to think of how I would rank his films. I'd probably put The Northman as my second favorite of his, because again, with his eye for period detail and his respect for history, I would say that Robert Eggers is the only reactionary filmmaker in Hollywood, and he's gone in interviews to basically say it as politely as possible. You'll notice a lot of his films have no diversity in them whatsoever, and he seems to choose period pieces that he would be able to say, well, I'm respecting the history and the perspectives of the people at the time. The Northman is a great example of that. It is brutal. It is uncompromising. The main character, Amleth, because it's retelling the story of Amleth, which was an old saga that was later adapted by Shakespeare into Hamlet. It takes these characters who are completely unpalatable to a modern mindset or modern Christian morality and shows them on their own terms.
He doesn't necessarily dress up. A lot of portrayals of Vikings are normally trying to make you sympathize with people and take sides. I'm thinking of a lot of the TV series that have been inundating,
like Vikings.
Yeah,
I've never watched it.
Or what's it called? The one with Uhtred Ragnarsson. That one.
Is that not
Kingdom?
Viking? Oh, I've not watched.
Anyway, all of those, I think they don't have enough respect for the history of it. Whereas one of the first scenes is when they carry out a raid on a Russian village, and it portrays the Vikings for what they actually did, the raiding, and it's awful. It's a truly awful thing. And at one point, you know, the character we're following is murdering men like it's nothing, and at one point he even hits a man off his horse with an axe, and then while he's on the ground bites his throat out and howls like a wolf. And this is the guy you're meant to sympathize with for the rest of the film.
Yeah, and also it shows that his fellow raiders herding a load of the women and children and the weak men into a hut and then burning it down. So it's uncompromising in its portrayal of what those raids would have looked like, and then of course those who survive, they take on a load of the women as slaves to be sold off.
But what Eggers does here by visualizing these things that did happen in history is it gives you a means of thinking about them in a much more human way. It's not just an abstraction that, oh, this thing happened. Like, one of the things that I rewatched that raid scene recently, just to sort of prepare for this. And one thing that struck me is that, well, if you're struggling to survive, you're not necessarily thinking about morality. You're thinking about, how are these things useful to me? And so there's a sort of twisted logic to everything the Vikings do, because all of it is sort of optimizing what is best for me. It's an entirely different way of looking at things. They're not thinking about morality, although, by their own morality, it is moral, right?
Well, it's the fact that it can show you scenes like that, and by the end of the film still have you rooting for Amleth and sympathizing with what he's going through, is the sign of a very, very impressive filmmaker who really knows how to tell these stories. Although, the Witch, what did you think of The Witch?
I think The Witch was actually one of my favourites. I really liked the whole approach to the film, the theme, the pacing of it. I liked the almost mythological approach to portraying a witch, where you don't really see her that much.
You see her very early on in the film.
You do see her early on in the film, but she doesn't take up much of the, much of the runtime, should I say. And also, she sort of changes form a little bit. And it's sort of, even though they sort of give you the money shot and you see the witch early on, you kind of don't feel like it's been spoiled. Because also she's, you see this horrible old woman, then you see this young woman, and it's because of the magic she's used.
Well, if nothing else, The Witch is interesting because it does something that Eggers likes to do. I've seen even from this film, which is as early as possible let you know that there are dark forces operating in the world, and any sort of rationalistic explanations that the characters are giving, because in The Witch, obviously, the rationalistic explanation could be that, oh well, they're all hallucinating because of the fact that they've got mold on their crops. No, that's not what's happening. There is a witch playing with forces behind the scenes, and everything that they're trying to do to prevent the inevitable from happening is futile, which if anything makes the film just that little bit more horrific. He doesn't play with suspense in the way that you expect some filmmakers to do. The suspense is the more Hitchcockian, which is that you know that something is, you the audience know what's wrong, the characters don't yet. So you are subject to more knowledge than they are, which can add to the suspense.
Yeah, I do agree.
I think the Witch was a really interesting debut for him. He kind of exploded onto the scene with that, and it set up his love for the period accurate dialogue. Because really, I'd say it's that and the Lighthouse, which has the most period accurate dialogue in it. And I'd say The Witch is the most impressive because it's going back to the late 17th century. And it took me a few watches to really get to grips with what the characters were even saying. And to be able to get child actors, multiple child actors, to convincingly give performances while delivering that dialect is insane.
I also thought the attention to detail in that they all have a sort of northern, almost Mancunian accent, don't they, when they're talking, but a sort of archaic one. And that attention to detail where, only a handful of English people watching would be like, oh, that sounds really authentic.
Clickety-clackety.
Mercy!
Clickety-clackety. Clickety-clackety.
Liars, well, now just rotten. I be a washing father's clothes like a slave, and thou art playing idle.
Because mother hates you.
Spoilt child. Tell mother you have left the farm alone.
Blackfoot says I can do what I like.
Devil take your black fillet.
Surefoot I can't leave the yard. I could go to the brook before you let the witch take Sam.
But if I had to rank the films, I'd probably put Lighthouse number 1, probably Nosferatu second, purely for the visual aspect of it. I'll get into why I think there are things that prevent it from being top. Then The Witch, and then finally The Northman.
You'd put the Northman last.
Mm-hmm.
It's that lack of Germanic admixture in you. Clearly, it sets you off. All you see is the Viking raiders assaulting your ancestors, where I see my ancestors assaulting your ancestors.
If you would like to see the full version of this premium video, please head over to lotuseaters.com and subscribe to gain full access to all of our premium content.